Hello, our story begins inside the book of Moff Tarkin. Pen to paper, the way to ensure his secrets, thoughts, and aspirations could never be touched. Pen to paper was a lost form, especially in such an expansive galaxy. But there were always concerns of individuals trying to gain power. If they truly wanted to be a functional government, a functional military doctrine, things needed to be tighter. Tarkin wrote the words as they came to mind. An entire doctrine named after him, an entire system of militaristic control in honor of the man who sat humbly behind his desk instead of his personal Star Destroyer. Tarkin's eyes drifted from his desk to the window. Outside, he could see space, and at the lower right of the corner of the window was the edge of another Imperial One Star Destroyer. The Empire was growing, it was powerful, and he was to thank for that expansion. He smiled to himself. All these were simple ramblings, the thoughts of a man that desired to control the galaxy. Maybe not to take it from his dear old friend the Emperor, but maybe, indeed, to do so. Tarkin's eyes slid across the room. In the left corner of the room there was the armor plating of a Jedi Temple guard, one that was slain during the siege on the temple. He always found it fitting. Their spirits could never bring them to find victory, but he always thought that style of armor would have allowed them to actually be wartime heroes. His disliking of the Jedi could only be measured in hate, and his care for their religion was as little to none. The religious implications of their dead kind on a political body were an overstep. It had been seen throughout Republic history, the drawbacks of the government from the Jedi, and now nothing. Tarkin's eyes remained on the guard uniform, pristine as the Jedi like to see themselves, but easy to penetrate. As the still remaining blaster marks said, a religion of powers that could simply be dominated by the will of a man. Tarkin's own philosophy on them could wait, but he did have his own concerns and theories regarding the survival of the Jedi Order, but it existing in other myriad forms, none to which Tarkin was willing to admit at this current moment. His eyes moved across his office and he looked at the guard uniform of the Royal Guards, the red motionless creatures that moved without speaking but full of purpose, the most loyal and dedicated to the Empire. His eyes slid back down to his book. It was still being written, and his hand creased around a pen, wrinkles of time showing themselves on his skin, and time in his mind, understandings and perceptions had changed. He placed the pen on the paper, a fine, delicate cursive-like iteration of Galactic Common read out, the manifesto of Moff Tarkin. His initial ramblings would find their home inside this book. Secrets, theories, ideas, lies, whispers, and everything in between would be known to him and him alone, no longer bouncing around inside the chambers of his mind. Tarkin grinned sadistically as he continued forward. His doctrine, one of military strength, was put in place to destroy the rebels and ensure the system of the Empire remained domineering. However, there had been a rise in rebellious activities. These were no doubt in correlation to the looseness of the Imperial structure. Despite the Tarkin doctrine taking a foothold in the Galactic Empire, its place was only deemed necessary by a complacent Senate, one that served a... Tarkin's mind trailed off. Before he could finish the statement, his hologram buzzed, and he gently picked up the edge of the book and watched the pages slide down to cover up the beginning of what he wanted to write. When he opened the hologram, it was Director Orson Krennic. He informed Tarkin that there had been a new development at the Project Stardust, one that he wanted Tarkin to take a look at, specifically because they'd been working on this together for such a long time. Tarkin nodded his head and ended the hologram as he stood up and placed his book in his drawer. He went to the hangar and his personal shuttle lifted off and departed for Scarif. Upon his arrival, he was greeted by a group of Imperial officers, and then began the joy of logistics. They expressed that there were some issues with the reactor during preparations for the jump to hyperspace. Despite the Death Star being an incredible-looking weapon, it was still far from complete in their minds. They couldn't put the dish onto the weapon itself until they finished the internal work. Aside from that, there were some simple housekeeping issues that they wanted to inform him on. Truthfully, he knew what this was. Krennic and Tarkin had a very passive-aggressive relationship. They were competing for power over the Death Star, but the Emperor and Tarkin were really good friends. So there was no doubt for the Grand Moff that he would be gifted control over the Death Star. The only thing was, for him, how he would secure it if he wasn't given that control. Tarkin could just steal it, never mind. What would Krennic do? As a director, he wasn't even close to the role of Grand Moff. And even though it was a military director, there wasn't a tidbit of concern in Tarkin's mind. Director Krennic forced Tarkin to abandon his manifesto so he could get the status report on something that was really beyond his own control. Tarkin wasn't the scientific head of operations. What exactly was he supposed to do aside from propose more funding to Palpatine? At the moment, there was this competition between Stardust and the TIE Defender project that Thrawn was trying to herald in. So perhaps they wanted him for the purpose of making sure the budget wasn't cut. But who cares? Tarkin sank down into his seat on his personal shuttle and disappeared into his mind as he closed his eyes. The icy Imperial officer was known for an array of things. So much of his life had been about power, and now at the top of his power, he had remaining questions about himself. Before understanding himself, there lay the questions of where his loyalties lay. As he was writing before he was rudely interrupted by that incompetent nuisance, he was considering the logistics of Palpatine being a secret Jedi. Tarkin had put things together by this point. Vader was probably Anakin Skywalker. There were hints, and while it didn't matter to him, he knew that Vader and the Jedi shared very basic traits. Even if Vader wasn't Anakin, it didn't matter. They were dead and flawed religious individuals who latched onto a power that no one in the galaxy remembered. Thanks to Palpatine, the Force was nothing but a forgotten mysticism held by a religion that betrayed the galaxy. But Tarkin had realized, in accordance to his realizations about Vader, that he was under some sort of tutelage. If this was indeed the case, then who was the instructor, or as the mystic types would call it, master? Tarkin thought, reflecting on his own past with the Jedi. To him, it didn't matter if Palpatine was a Jedi or something else. It mattered because they were a system that needed to be erased. If Palpatine was what he believed him to be, then what could stop him from becoming another Dooku? Granted, Tarkin wasn't ill-advised enough to believe that Palpatine would start a war like Dooku, but the complacent nature of the Jedi could be shared with another religious type, no? Part of this was coming from Tarkin's own distaste of Force religions, but also a realization that Palpatine would see him as competition soon. Throughout his career with Palpatine, he noticed that sometimes people who got too close to having too much political or militaristic influence would just simply disappear. It never bothered him because why would it? He was close in ties to the Emperor, but that seemed like that would be coming to an end very soon. As a way to negate that, he needed to come up with his own rationale to potentially kill his friend. Though in accordance to his thoughts regarding the complacency of the Force religions, Tarkin did have to admit that like the Jedi, Palpatine was allowing rebellions to arise. Perhaps it was because of backtalk from the Senate, but there was a genuine concern from Tarkin about the political ineffectiveness of his longtime ally. He didn't want to admit it, but for their personal power and for the continued stability of the Empire, it was necessary. The Tarkin doctrine itself had great power, but its influence was shrinking. Not because they didn't have power, troopers, fleets, or more, it was because the Senate put a cap on all of their power. And if his friend was a true emperor, one with indefinite power in the galaxy, then why wouldn't he be able to tell the Senate to do what he wanted? Obviously, Tarkin wasn't dull. He understood the ins and outs of the Imperial Senate. He just floated the rhetorical question around in his mind. Tarkin had been proposing ideas to the Imperial military leaders, and with his great influence, he returned to his fleet. Thrawn was dealing with insurgents on Lothal. Tarkin was controlling an entire quadrant of the galaxy with his influence. They were not the same, but they were competitors. As he settled back down behind his desk, he picked up where he left off at. He read from his journal along at his head. Despite the Tarkin doctrine taking a foothold in the Galactic Empire, its place was only deemed necessary by a complacent Senate, one that served an emperor that could not control adequately. Emperor Palpatine's influence over the galactic political battleground could not be overstated, but in his years since rising to power, it was clear that complacency had brought him down. Like the Jedi before him, he served a mystical power called the Force, one that he instilled to his apprentice. Tarkin believed that there were ulterior motives for the Emperor, ones that did not relate to the continued tranquility and elongation of Imperial reign. As he understood, if the Empire was to supersede the Republic in power and in influence, then someone needed to do what was necessary, regardless of the babbling that took place between those delimitous beings inside the Senate chambers. It was from Tarkin's understanding that a true military doctrine, one named after himself, was one that would not bow to ancient mysticisms. It would bow to logic and intelligence, with individuals that could understand the delicacy of ruling an empire. To rid the galaxy of rebellion, one needed to control hope. It was the one thing stronger than fear, and it seemed that the Emperor had lost his touch in regard to that. A proposal should... Tarkin's thoughts were interrupted again when a buzz came at his door. Similar to how he did previously, his book closed and he looked up. The command bridge officer on deck informed him They'd had a transmission from a scientific base at Edu. They had developed the bombs he was interested in. Tarkin smiled and thanked him as the officer shuffled out of the way. The Grand Moff's red splinter eyes were bone-chilling to even cross paths with. Tarkin quickly contacted Edu and got into communication with one of the head scientists, who expressed that the meteor storm was ready. He asked them for their trial results immediately, and as he said the word, a beep came at his tablet. Tarkin thanked the Imperial scientist as the call ended. He scanned through the reports and found them to be greatly impressive. Within moments of pressing a button below his desk drawer, the officer from before ran in. Tarkin told them to move the flagship to Edu. They had to collect some toys. Instead of returning to his manifesto, Tarkin abandoned the room altogether and prepared for the next leg of his inner thoughts. He reached the bridge of his ship as it launched into hyperspace. With his hands, he held them behind his back as he considered the idea of destroying Palpatine. It would come. It was necessary. And as Grand Moff, one with such presence in the galaxy, he could make a move for the role of Emperor. His only concern was individuals like Grand Admiral Thrawn, who were fiercely loyal to the Emperor. Individuals like Grand Moff Gideon, Fleury Veru, Gon, Naomi Dragon, or Cole Cerdan could be seen as potential competitors. Tarkin knew them all by name, and he understood that those with influence in the core systems like Naomi or Fleury of Corellia, or potentially Moff Gideon, who like Yularen worked with the ISB for a period of time, could try and gun for this power. In an era without Palpatine, Imperial Moffs could flock for control. But there, of course, were ways to control this. The issue was ensuring that these things stayed under control. As a means to ensure prosperity for himself, he would need an individual to join him on this endeavor. Luckily for him, there were those, despite popular belief, that despised Palpatine from within the Empire. Before they arrived outside of Edu, Tarkin was able to get into contact with a longtime ally of his. She wasn't exactly his age. She was in her mid-30s and she was sponsored by him. In the same way that Palpatine oversaw Padme's career as she ascended into the Senate, was the same way Tarkin oversaw Isabur Kovik's ascension within the Imperial Security Bureau. He contacted her from his office and explained that he required her oversight, believing that, in quotes, there was a rebel mole working within this vessel. She immediately left Coruscant for Edo, where she would meet up with Tarkin as the Meteor project was unloaded onto his flagship. Tarkin and Isabur walked through the corridors together. He plainly asked her about her time within the Bureau, and if there were any external support she needed. Isabur wasn't dumb. She knew why Tarkin brought her out here. She could count on both of her hands the number of times she had to expose a foolish officer within his ranks or throw someone under a pod racer so Tarkin could earn more favorability. They were a tight duo, but not a care for the other could be shared. They understood their roles in each other's lives. A duo loyal to each other only for power and for the security of the Empire. Isabur understood that Tarkin placed her into her role so that he could earn her loyalty, and in return, she could make decisions that would determine the future of the Empire for him. In all fairness, she could tell everyone who he was and what he did, but why do that when she could be given infinite security within the Empire itself? They were allies, and that was their role. With the meteors loaded up into the vessel, they were departing for the Emperor's secret base at Jakku. Palpatine wanted them to visit for another special debriefing on another step in another plan of his. It wouldn't be bold to tell Tarkin about Necromancer, but more so his contingencies if he were to die. Palpatine wanted Tarkin to be in control of all Imperial responsibilities in the cases of him dying due to rebels or something else. Despite Tarkin not understanding the depths of Palpatine's Necromancer strategy, he did know that if Palpatine died, the Empire would face a wave of pain not seen since the fall of the Republic. In Tarkin's mind, he understood the desire for control, but not to this extent. To punish loyal systems was different from punishing non-loyal systems and breaking them to the will of the Empire. As a flagship departed from Edu and jumped into hyperspace towards Jakku, Tarkin unveiled his plan to Isabur. He told her everything he wanted, and he would press a button on his wrist to indicate whether or not they were going to move forward with this plan. Tarkin passed the device across the table and connected his to it. Essentially, the device was a communicator. Silent, but very useful. Upon pressing one button, it would activate a given command on the other device. Isabur would know exactly what to do in any given circumstance. While Tarkin's manifesto wasn't finished yet, he was truthfully seeking a more controlled empire. If he could sustain control, then he could do what Palpatine may have been incapable of. If Palpatine was a former Jedi, their religious values could hold him back. Palpatine never showed signs of having those values, but Tarkin understood, from his perspective, that he was more calculated than ever before, and Palpatine could not compete with those calculations. When they arrived at Jakku, the Grand Moff departed to the surface for hours, and inside the secret facility, he would come to his conclusion. As he left the surface of Jakku, inside of his Imperial shuttle, Isabel was alerted. She was given Tarkin's spare command cylinder. It was exchanged with the officer on deck when he wasn't looking, and she used the cylinder to plug into the meteor drop inside the hangar bay, which activated the devices. The meteors poured out of the hangars as the officers on deck ran to make sure they could fix it. The ISB agent was able to set everything up so that the officer looked responsible for this betrayal, and as he tried to correct a wrong, he only certified his fate. Tarkin's shuttle dodged the meteor's shower as the explosive rocks plummeted to the ground surface. Palpatine, who was walking inside the facility, didn't even notice. The rocks collided with the ground in the facility, and explosives rang out. Right on impact, Palpatine turned back with shock, realizing that they had been betrayed by Tarkin. The only individual he never anticipated to be a knife in his side became the dagger in his heart. Palpatine used the Force to guide the meteors away from him, but as he did, they exploded, consuming his body. Palpatine didn't believe that he had any reason to fear these meteors. Either it was a meteor storm, or it was a trap laid by Tarkin, but it was neither. It was bombs implanted into meteors and dropped to make it look like a meteor storm. Upon his arrival to the flagship, Tarkin demanded that troop transports deployed to the surface immediately. As he said this, Agent Kovic dragged the officer through the hangar bay with Imperial escort. He cried out, telling both her and Tarkin that he didn't do it. It wasn't what he looked like. But with only two witnesses, one being Kovic and the other one being him, and the command cylinder with his name on it being used, no one could refute that it was he who did it. Tarkin looked to the Death Trooper who was behind Agent Kovic and nodded his head. The Death Trooper picked him up by the neck and held him in the air, choking him to death before his body was dropped. Tarkin placed both of his hands behind his back as he told Agent Kovic to accompany him to Coruscant. In the circumstance that the Emperor perished, they would need to maintain control over the Empire. He turned to the Death Troopers and told them to dispose of this useless body. Wilhuff and Isabel moved to the Lambda shuttle and lifted off, departing for Coruscant as the Star Destroyer went into high alert. They spoke briefly in hyperspace about his plans. Tarkin wanted her to tell Yularen that there was a traitor within their midst. It would be important to check every single Moff. They'd be gunning for power. She asked about him, and he told her that he was with the Emperor when this rebel attack occurred. Is that understood? She nodded her head. A rebel attack could make sense, though her fear was for the crew that actually saw it. Well, being that the officer dropped the meteors, they could technically cover it up as a rebel sympathizer getting into Imperial ranks. Therefore, there'd be a need for more checks on Moffs, officers, and generals. In Tarkin's mind, this was the perfect way to expand, but also insert more oversight into the Tarkin doctrine. Upon their arrival, Tarkin went to the Emperor's office where he waited for Mas Amedda. Isambard would return to the ISB building to report her findings and begin the next leg of Tarkin's plan, one fully explained to her on their way here from Jakku. After waiting for some time, he revealed to Mas that the Emperor was likely compromised at Jakku. By this point, Tarkin realized that he was flawed for not explaining to the crew, or at least having Isambard tell the crew that he was potentially in danger. Regardless of that miniature mistake, the reports found Palpatine's body, or what was left of it. Unbeknownst to them, Palpatine did not return to Exegol. He had been shredded by the bomb, one he could have never prepared for and one he could have never essence transferred away from. Mas Amedda asked him what they were going to do about it, and Tarkin looked over to the window where his friend once sat. He allowed an emotion to spring out of him. His eyes turned red with pain, and he looked to Mas Amedda and expressed that they would do what Palpatine would want them to do. Tarkin acted like he was toughening up as he told Mas to call an emergency session inside the Senate. There would be a new emperor, one that would make an example of these rebels. Mas was so surprised by Tarkin's emotions that he quickly did as the Grand Moff asked. Tarkin obviously was not being realistic with them. He just was simply playing the game, and Mas fell for it. What a shame. Tarkin would spend the next several hours inside the Imperial Senate building. He would debrief them on the changes he would make. With the Emperor gone, a strong leader would be needed, and as his Emperor's closest confidant, he would fill that role for him. Tarkin then expressed that with Palpatine gone, he would enact a new legislation, one to expand the Tarkin doctrine to a much larger scale, no longer putting a cap on the number of destroyers, soldiers, and tech the Empire needed. Its military had to be prepared for whatever came, especially in light of this insurgent attack on the Emperor. The tragedy, especially for the senators that opposed Palpatine, is they saw the end of hope. Tarkin was preparing for a war against a foe equal in size, a foe that could go toe-to-toe in naval combat with the Empire, and compared to a ground military that could conquer the galaxy in one fell swoop. There was realistically no need for a military of this size, but Tarkin did not care. He was the father of the Tarkin doctrine, and he would ensure the stability of the Empire. There was, of course, his one miniature issue. Vader and his loyalty to the Emperor could fall out from under him without Palpatine around. Tarkin had to come up with a plan for how he'd handle individuals like Vader. He was currently on Jakku investigating the incident regarding his master. He would have to uncover his own emotions about it. There was no knowledge of the twins, and he was essentially the last of his kind, being that Kenobi was able to defeat Maul on Tatooine. On Coruscant, Tarkin returned to his new office. It was once Palpatine's, but now he could forge the Empire with his ideals in mind. He stood at the edge of the window and looked over the city of Coruscant. What a lovely view. But there were better ones in the galaxy. The one that came to mind for him was from his command deck inside the Death Star. His eyes turned back to the Royal Guard, placed 3 by 3 on opposite sides of the room. His empire was born. It would be his to control. Without a shadow of a doubt, he would instill true fear in his enemies, and force them to buckle to the will of power, to the will of his doctrine of military strength. Tarkin got to work by calling each of the Grand Moffs around the galaxy and bringing them to Coruscant. With Vader still trying to figure out his purpose, this elicited Tarkin time to seize true control over the Senate and of course the Galactic Empire. The rise of rebellion had been on each of their minds. Grand Admiral Thrawn was preparing to move forward with some of his own plans on the TIE Defender, and without the approval from Palpatine, he was awaiting the Emperor's grant. When Thrawn learned that Palpatine died, he was very disenchanted. He only joined the Empire because their order would establish peace and control across the galaxy. He feared for what Tarkin could do, and what he would do. But because of the rapid change, with almost immediate results due to the office of Emperor being in Tarkin's hands, he was able to expand the military budget exponentially. When Grand Admiral Thrawn arrived at Coruscant, he asked about how things were going to go, and the Emperor told the Admiral exactly what he told the Moffs the day before. They walked through the chambers of the Emperor's office and out into the halls as they did. A royal escort of 6 guards trailed behind them. Tarkin told Thrawn that despite their competition during the era of Palpatine, there'd be no such complications in this era. Palpatine's crime was committing himself to a Senate that had no power. Tarkin wasn't aware of how close Palpatine was to actually getting rid of the Senate, but that didn't matter anymore. Tarkin expressed that to control the galaxy, they must exert themselves. Thrawn listened very carefully. The Emperor promised funding for the TIE Defender project on the fall. If he could complete a successful test run of the vessel, then he would sanction its creation at Kuat. Without true competition between Stardust, TIE Defenders, and whatever other projects the Imperial War Machine was cooking up, they could focus on their control over territory with rebel activity, rather than bickering. Thrawn liked this, but there was more. The two of them walked between the pillars in the executive building, and to the landing platform. Tarkin raised his hand and gestured outwards towards the city, and asked Thrawn how one controls an empire. The Chiss Admiral looked to the ally of his, and placed his hands behind his back, and turned with a devilish grin, saying one word, hope. Tarkin smiled, and he asked, how could they control the hope of an entire empire, one that spanned the galaxy? Thrawn's smile kept up as he asked Tarkin what he had in mind. The Emperor told him that they would crush it. If they could control hope, then all that remained was fear. He turned fully to face Thrawn, telling him that instead of capturing and interrogating, they would execute, flog, and gibbet them. Didn't matter what it was or who they were. If he had to round up a bundle of pirates and label them as rebels, then do it. All that mattered was what the people saw. Thrawn asked if they should lie to their citizens, and Tarkin nodded his head. His nose tightened and his jaw clenched. If the citizens saw rebels facing these capital punishments, then it would dissolve any appeal of rebellion. Thrawn did agree with this, but in all fairness, Tarkin hadn't seen how tough they were. Of course, the rebels that Tarkin did see weren't General Syndulla. Thrawn respected a general that could stand on their own in the arena of combat, but Tarkin was right. Not every general or commander or operative for the Alliance was General Syndulla. To maximize their control, they could take anyone. If they needed to pull people out of prisons to do it, they could. Make people disappear off the streets. If it was scum in the lower city, no one would miss them, but it had to be done correctly. Thrawn's initial reservations regarding Tarkin had since dissipated. The man knew what he was going to do. Tarkin also spoke more extensively about how he planned to expand the Tarkin Doctrine, how each of the Moffs would progressively gain more power, and with said power, how they were instructed to use it. There were some freedoms, but the power of the Senate would be stripped from it, and handed over to more deserving and like-minded individuals. Immediately, these plans were put into effect as Thrawn returned to Lothal to begin setting up the TIE Defender Foundry. A few tests would be run, and they would essentially go from there. At the same time, each of these Moffs were setting up their new systems of punishment. Due to the Imperial victories before Palpatine's death, they were able to throw dead people clothes onto innocent people. Well, not innocent, but pirates, spice runners, syndicate members, and lowlifes. These people were, in accordance to Emperor Tarkin's mandate, strewn up in front of local and galactic broadcasts and publicly executed. Tarkin himself then made sure that a new Imperial face would be recognized as the Executioner. An Imperial captain was plucked from her ranks, a stormtrooper named Tomahawk, or in other words, TK-7179. She was a former Purge trooper, and because there was no need for their kind anymore, she was relegated to command as a captain. It wasn't the worst thing ever, pay was the same, but she was forced to wear normal Imperial armor. She kept the Purge trooper badge, but now, with Tarkin, she was given a new role. She was offered the role of the Executioner, and she took it with pride. As a means to make her stand out, she was given updated Imperial armor, a prototype but fully modified for her. Every day, a new rebel or two would face one of three punishments: flogging, gibbet, or of course suspendum, as the Inquisitors once did to former Jedi. Crowds of patriotic Imperials were assembled, and it was broadcast across the galaxy. On Coruscant, these broadcasts would get galactic attention, whereas on Eridu it might get local or system attention. In the meantime, while the Executioner got to work, Tarkin's good friend, the new lead commander of the Imperial side of ISB investigations, Isabur Kovic, informed him that everything had been completed. He was completely clear of any potential blame. He thanked her for her hard work. Before he could move to his Imperial destroyer and finish his manifesto, he was visited by a lovely little friend. Tarkin had about a week to prepare for this, between all the meetings and Vader's thorough investigation of Jakku and return to Mustafar to contemplate his own place in the universe. Without Palpatine, he was free, and so he decided that control was his own to have. Tarkin set the Empire up perfectly for him. He could have all the power in the galaxy if he wanted. But did he really want that? So after a full week of working hard on building a new empire, one in complete and total unison with the Tarkin doctrine, he was visited by Vader. The Dark Lord stepped into the room and looked at the change. All the Sith artifacts had been disposed of. Palpatine's lightsaber was put up on a stand, showing Vader that Tarkin understood who and what they were. The Dark Apprentice stormed in, past the Royal Guard who reacted, but Tarkin raised his hand. He was standing on the other side of his desk, looking out the window when Vader stormed in. Tarkin turned back and started to move around the desk. He looked at Vader and welcomed him in kindly. The Dark Lord lifted his hand and Tarkin felt his ability to breathe slip out of his lungs as he moved his hand for his neck. Vader towered over him as Tarkin squeezed out a few words, trying to get Vader to stop what it was that he was doing. Vader lessened his grip just out of curiosity, and Tarkin asked Vader if he was searching for purpose. The Dark Lord looked down, hovering his other hand over his lightsaber, with the other one still raised but not fully choking the new Emperor. The Royal Guards were about to react, but they didn't. They were waiting for Tarkin's command. He didn't even address them though, telling Vader that they had served a long time with each other. Tarkin understood that Vader didn't want political leadership. His tutelage to Palpatine wasn't what he wanted either. Vader was a champion, and he deserved to be recognized as one. But Palpatine never gave him such an opportunity, no? As Tarkin spoke, he could feel the grip around his neck releasing. This was it. He had him. Tarkin told Vader that if he wanted true purpose, he could find it as a champion, because heroes of wars fade into obscurity, but public icons are remembered forever. Vader gripped his lightsaber and Tarkin could feel the tension between the two of them. The Royal Guard watched Tarkin's move, but he didn't buckle. He told Vader that, in his patience, he would be able to find the secrets of being a champion. Vader ignited his lightsaber and dragged it around and stopped it at the edge of Tarkin's neck, and asked what kind of champion. The Emperor didn't even flinch. He looked at the lightsaber, the red glow beating his eyes like staring into the sun. He smiled and looked at the creature who tried to intimidate him. Tarkin's grin moved up the right side of his face and his eyebrows tightened as he looked through them. He told Vader that he could be a gladiator. The Empire was moving forward into the direction of a more grounded punishment system. Tarkin stepped forward and raised one of his elbows and lifted his hand, putting it against Vader's wrist and pushing it to the side ever so slightly. He told Vader that in the gladiatorial arena, he would find purpose. He would find passion and strength. The galaxy would look to him unlike ever before. Tarkin flicked Vader's armor and told him that he could get rid of this rustic piece of trash that Palpatine put him into. Vader stood there, motionless for a moment, bewildered by the resilience of Tarkin in this moment. Not even a flinch. The Emperor turned around and waved his hand as a royal guard slapped their stabs into the ground and moved back into their stationary stance. Vader's lightsaber deignited as he thought momentarily. Without love, life, the Sith, or the Jedi, and full freedom, perhaps this was the right direction to go into. He asked the Emperor when they would have these arenas ready. Tarkin waved his hand over and pointed down. There was an executioner station that had been erected since he became Emperor. Just beyond that, as he tilted his head up, was where they were going to put the Galactic Coliseum. It would be bigger than pod racing, Tarkin said with an almost sinister tone, before turning back and moving towards the exit, as if Vader was nothing but a ghost to him. Vader stood in the room alone, staring out the window, faced with the potential becoming a gladiatorial champion. Tarkin returned to his destroyer and picked up right where he left off about a week ago. It had been so long, but he skimmed through his words, and thought it was charming how he considered the presence of Palpatine to be a logistical threat to the Empire. It was correct, which is why he would continue his manifesto. Each step following the original script got even more unhinged. It followed from right where he left off with a sudden change of direction as it said, "To rid the galaxy of rebellion, one needed to control hope. It was the only thing stronger than fear, and it seemed that the Emperor had lost his touch in regard to that. After having been the architect of change himself, Tarkin had now concluded that an empire was only as strong as its leader. A dreary future had vanished, as his fear for a potential win no longer existed. In a scenario where an emperor is unable to contain rebellion, they must be replaced with urgency. The people must be given their own distractions, and the hope must be extinguished. The doctrine would establish true strength, one that would be recognized in every corner of the galaxy." Tarkin rambled on, his pen losing its touch as he continued. When he completed the manifesto of Moff Tarkin, he touched it up and prepared it for safekeeping. He couldn't live forever, but his ideals were more than he was. Without an offspring, his legacy died with him. But it was like he said, public figures reign longer than war heroes. They can be forgotten in the mythos. What Tarkin would do was ensure his legacy lived long past that of his life. Despite the Emperor ensuring his own longevity, there were other responsibilities he needed to attend to. The first of which was his control over the Senate. For the following few months, that would be the name of his game. The first senator executed was Rita Chuchi. Her public execution, as one of the youngest members of the body, was polarizing, but Tarkin didn't care. He had control, and he would enforce it, whether they liked it or not. He was their emperor, and no one would take that from him. During this period of time, the Galactic Coliseum of Coruscant was finished. Just outside of it was the galaxy-known execution station. In only months, thousands had been killed there. Upon the opening of the Coliseum, Vader would have his first real challenger. He now donned new armor, stuff that made him flexible, and he would fight and slaughter a rancor in front of billions. Despite Tarkin wanting to be present, he had other things to attend to. Grand Admiral Thrawn and his TIE Defender had been defeated and lost at Lothal. The local Moff tried to suggest they leave the planet alone, but Tarkin had him executed, and then after that, sending a monstrous fleet to destroy the entire capital city of Lothal, leaving not a single survivor. Executioner squads were sent down to the planet to finish the job. The Emperor intended on continuing his purge of Alliance-related forces, but the time for that had gone. He needed to be at the Coliseum for the final ceremony. The Imperial citizens of the core roared in excitement. The blood sport gave them something to take their mind off the executions. While the flogging of rebels every day worked really well on Outer Rim citizens, it had the inverse effect on core and Imperial-bred citizens. Not that they pitied it, rather they just didn't want to see it, because it was rather unbearable. While the immediate effect of the leveling of Lothal wouldn't be felt, the long-term results would be the fleeting of rebellion in the coming months. When they learned of the Death Star plans, an entire sequence followed, one where a squad, eventually by the name of Rogue One, snuck onto the base at Scarif. Despite the Death Star's completion and Tarkin being overwhelmingly pleased with it, he knew that to exterminate these rebels, they needed to trap them. A task force was then sent to cut them off. There would be no need to endanger the Death Star. It may be finished, and its test at Jedha was effective, but they needed more. This for the Alliance was their last attempt at true victory. If they could make a strike, they might be able to inspire resistance, but instead, what they got was disappointment. Sure, they got the Death Star plans from Scarif, and sure, they were able to surprise the Empire, but when the Tantive 4 was traced across the galaxy to Tatooine, it was not captured. The glimmer of hope in the galaxy fell into fire. Moff Gideon, whose fleet had been dispatched to Scarif, was the one who aboard a Star Destroyer ordered the destruction of the Alderaanian transport. Didn't matter who was inside. Despite it killing Leia, 3PO, and R2, there were still rebels out there, but again, this didn't matter. Tarkin initially planned on getting rid of the Death Star plans by having them secured, but the method selected by this particular Moff was fine with him. The destruction of the Death Star plans meant that they couldn't find the weakness, especially not with Galen Erso dead, but this was a necessary loss. The legacy of Galen Erso's failure would have to be covered up, and with Tarkin's orders, they took the superweapon into hiding and searched for months until finding the exhaust port and giving it a nice frame, making it impossible to penetrate. All the while, Tarkin would continue forcing the Imperial Senate to stay alive. He called Palpatine out on giving the Senate room to function, but Tarkin forced them to see their own failures. Their mistakes were certified, and the Empire was more powerful with the doctrine than it ever was with them. The budget cuts made for the Imperial military were necessary, especially because Tarkin used them to begin building larger vessels and funding more conscriptions. But the expansion of Imperial military personnel didn't mean the Empire wouldn't have budget cuts in the following year. Tarkin planned a system that would favor the doctrine and then slowly put money back towards the social programs the people of the Senate said they cared about. Regardless of that, a week or two following the disappearance of Leia Organa, the Princess of Alderaan, Tarkin and his guard made a show on Alderaan itself. With his Imperial fleet arriving, he arrived to Commander Kovic, standing on a landing platform with a couple members of her unit and weapons pointing at the royal family. Due to Isambur working on internal Imperial affairs, this was technically considered one of those. They had been on the trail for months. It wasn't until the Battle of Scarif that they realized Bail and Brea were a part of the rebel movement. When Tarkin arrived, he verbally berated them, before making an example out of them. But this time, instead of Captain Tomahawk being the executioner, the Emperor himself would make a statement. He would tell the entire galaxy that the Princess of Alderaan was a part of a rebel attack on an Imperial facility at Scarif. The attack resulted in the loss of life from several Imperial troopers. Following the battle, Moff Gideon tracked down the princess and destroyed her vessel. He stood there amongst the royals of Alderaan to prove that no social status could escape the grip of the Empire. The longer this rebellion continued, the longer people would have to suffer. None of this needed to be this way, but it was, because a few people couldn't resist trying to feel like they had a greater say than their own voice carried. As one united empire, they could be so much more, and so much more was greater than a past filled with traitors. His cunning statement ended with him pressing forward a lever and watching as the gibbet took the life of the Organas. Tarkin allowed the royal guards to remove the bodies of the fallen leaders, and then they continued from there. One by one, each member of the family was dragged up and done away with. And without even flinching, without blinking an eye, Tarkin stood with one arm tied behind his back and the other on the handle, and continued pushing it forward. The message this sent to the galaxy was one of absolute terror. A man driven so mad by rebellion that he would go so far as to lose his own humanity. But even to most people, it didn't seem as if the Emperor had any humanity left. He didn't seem to care who it was. The entire Organa bloodline was wiped away in the span of an hour-long broadcast. Emperor Tarkin continued forward without much worry for anything regarding rebellion. Out on Tatooine, once the harvest passed, young Luke Skywalker would go off to the Imperial Academy. His name may have turned a few heads, but no one high enough to alert Tarkin, and definitely no one close enough to inform the gladiatorial champion of Vader. With the rebellion vanishing into obscurity, Skywalker would become a navigator, following in his father's footsteps. He hadn't run into Ben before sneaking off-world with his uncle's permission. Luke believed he was following his father's lifestyle by being a spice navigator. The best part for Luke was getting far away from Tatooine and seeing the universe, completely oblivious of who his father really was, or whatever happened to his sister. When Obi-Wan realized he was gone, he'd begin a never-ending hunt to find him, one that he wouldn't ever complete. The Death Star remained elusive. It was a show of Imperial military, and the strength it possessed. Though the Emperor believed a second one was a bit overkill, so he made sure there were no attempts to construct a second iteration of the Death Star. The main station was successful enough in his mind. The Empire remained unchallenged, and Emperor Tarkin was seen most of the time within the Senate building or at the Colosseum, where he would watch Vader tank anything they threw at him. Tarkin's decision to create an arena game, or as they called it out in the Outer Rim, Tarkin Games, was one of the best decisions during his career as Emperor. These galactic Colosseums would be popping up across the galaxy. They brought in huge amounts of credits, and they were able to fund everything outwards. With a strong and stable future, Tarkin remained a powerhouse for years to come. However, his own personal strategy would come 4 years following the destruction of the Alliance at Scarif. Without an official battle to signify their end, it was Scarif that was regarded as the end of their cause. The rebels were regarded as villains. There was no repairing their image. But the Emperor, while watching his favorite gladiator, a man who was revered as the champion of the Colosseum, felt a chest pain. Tarkin had himself a heart attack, one that would claim his life. And despite all the pain he was in, he still watched the epitome of his life's work. Vader slayed a beast, one that was larger than he could have ever imagined. Tarkin's victory over Sidious would elongate the Empire for centuries. The legacy of the Empire would long outlive that of Palpatine and Vader, because Tarkin's Empire was one led by a manifesto, one regarded as the most important document in Imperial history. Not only that, but Tarkin's games would cement themselves in galactic commonplace for centuries to come as well. His allies, those like Captain Tomahawk and Commander Kovic, would ensure that his legacy was never trampled on. Tarkin's command over the galaxy would have its positives, but they would be overshadowed by a shift in galactic priorities, ones that revolved around the impact, usage, and effectiveness of the Tarkin Doctrine. And that, my friends, is our story. Again, special thanks to our patrons:
Benjamin Wells, Ozpin, Angel Dust, Alexandra Reese, The Beginning and End, Django Fat Clone, Nick5098, INTJ Recluse, Ben Ingram, The Big Red Pure Mark, Diamond Constant, Darth Nemesis, Lord Tibbs, CC2024, Galavic Gaming, Tristan Mandalore, Sir William 1767, Darth Revan, Granity Bane, Laliant, Sky Guy, Penguin, Cullen Rooney, Shark Midori, RJ38, Nick, Michael Erlanger, The Last Jedi, Apollo, Weewa670, Annika Stank Runner, CT7567, Toaster Oven, Oz of Oz, Darth Knox, The Eternal Padawan, Joshua Tam, Johnny DeGuin, Sansa Skeleton, Jedi Sloth, Mr. Yeet Gamer, Lord Cali, Galaxy 66, Magneto Studios, Anakin003, Lord Draken, Photos Legacy Star Wars, Airbus, Rex the Wolf, The Man with Three First Names, Dark Saint 46, Baron Joshua, and Lord Deadwing.
Before supporting the channel, smash that like button. Let's talk about the story. With this, I wanted to do a dark side take on both Andor and on Nemik's manifesto. Kind of having this idea where he's writing this manifesto throughout the story, and it has like a very important effect at the end of the story. With Tarkin, I felt like you kind of had to go with this really dark and gritty and rustic approach that you can't really have with other characters, and that's why this was so fun for me. It's like you're taking this icy cold director that has like no regard for anybody, and you can just like go with it, like just run with it. And so you take elements out of like stories like Andor or Hunger Games, and even historical elements like out of ancient Rome, and you kind of plant this into this guy, and that's where the idea for Tarkin's games came from. Is this idea of like this Roman Colosseum, and he's creating this galactic allure for this bloodshed. And he's able to do that because it's kind of like the professor says at the end of Bout of Songbirds and Snakes, is the price people are willing to pay for a good show, all the while they're not paying attention to the military doctrine that is established by his manifesto. So I hope you all enjoyed this kind of Andor-like story. If you all enjoyed, let me know. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.